Beneath the crowns and silk robes lies a truth the history books politely ignore: royalty can be utterly ridiculous. From monarchs who reigned for minutes to queens with pet zebras and emperors obsessed with jellyfish, these are the stories that sound like drunken tavern gossip, but are embarrassingly real. For every grand coronation, there's a moment of absurdity hiding in the shadows of the throne. Tonight, we're peeling back the velvet curtain on 101 tales so bizarre, you'll swear we made them up. Spoiler: we didn't commer. Before we dive in, make sure you're subscribed so you never miss another dive into the stranger side of history. And while you're here, drop a comment, tell me where in the world you're listening from, and what time it is right now on your clock. I have a feeling these royal tales hit differently at 3 a.m. than they do at lunchtime. King Louis XIV of France reigned for only 20 minutes. Picture it: Paris, 1830. The July Revolution was roaring through the streets, the kind of noisy, sweaty chaos that makes even the most secure monarch consider early retirement. In the royal palace, Louis Antoine, Duke of Angoulême, suddenly found himself King Louis XIX. The problem was, he didn't want the job, or maybe more accurately, he didn't want the revolution's severance package, which historically included either exile or the guillotine. His father, Charles X, had just abdicated, and Louis was next in line. He accepted the crown for exactly 20 minutes. Then he signed it away to his nephew, the future Louis Philippe, possibly while muttering something about hard pass. Historians still debate whether he even sat on a throne during those 20 minutes. It's like starting a new job, realizing on the first coffee break that everyone hates you, and handing your ID badge to the intern. A reign shorter than most lunch breaks, and yet it's technically on the books. Which raises an uncomfortable thought. If you can be king for only 20 minutes, how many monarchs didn't even get through breakfast before fate yanked the crown away? And speaking of questionable hygiene, Queen Elizabeth I owned over 3,000 dresses but bathed once a month. Elizabeth I was the ultimate fashion influencer of the Tudor court, minus the part where she didn't believe in soap. Her wardrobe was a textile empire, over 3,000 gowns dripping with pearls, gold thread, and the sort of embroidery that required someone's failing eyesight to produce. She wore dresses so elaborate that just getting dressed was a full-scale production involving multiple ladies-in-waiting. But for all her love of finery, Elizabeth took bathing about as seriously as most people take jury duty. Once a month, maybe. At the time, people thought frequent bathing could cause illness, so Elizabeth's once-a-month soak was seen as almost excessive. Imagine wearing lace ruffs and velvet bodices in a smoky, crowded court without the benefit of deodorant and still being considered a symbol of grace. Her perfume budget must have been astronomical, and yet her rule endured for decades. Maybe the secret to longevity is smelling like rose oil and royal willpower. Of course, not all royal indulgences aged quite so gracefully. King George IV had dentures made of hippopotamus ivory. By the time George IV reached middle age, his love of rich food and sugar had ruined his teeth. Dentistry in the early 19th century was essentially just carpentry in the mouth, so the king's solution was to commission dentures carved from hippopotamus ivory. Why hippo? Because it was dense, tough, and apparently the exotic animal equivalent of buying a luxury car. The ivory was filed, polished, and fitted into his royal mouth, allowing him to keep enjoying the endless parade of puddings and candied fruits that had wrecked his original teeth. These dentures, while durable, had the unsettling side effect of yellowing quickly and giving him a perpetually toothy, almost predatory grin. Guests at banquets reportedly couldn't decide whether to focus on the king's conversational wit or the faintly alarming gleam of his smile. But George IV wasn't the only royal whose quirks veered into the surreal. Some took their delusions to a whole new, fragile level. Princess Alexandra of Bavaria claimed she had swallowed a glass piano. In the annals of royal eccentricity, few stories glitter or shatter quite like that of Princess Alexandra of Bavaria. Born into the opulence of the 19th century Bavarian court, Alexandra lived in a palace of chandeliers, frescoes, and the soft echo of too many polite coughs in gilded halls. But somewhere between her embroidery lessons and her strolls in manicured gardens, she developed an extraordinary belief that she had swallowed an entire grand piano made of glass. Not a miniature model. Not a figurine, a full-sized concert hall beast of an instrument. Glass. Inside her. And it wasn't metaphorical. This was not the poetic music in the soul variety of delusion. Alexandra genuinely feared that if she moved the wrong way, the piano might shatter and kill her. She tiptoed through life, walking slowly and carefully, as if every step risked catastrophe. Court doctors couldn't convince her otherwise, perhaps because diagnosing imaginary internal furniture wasn't in the standard medical handbook. To her credit, she remained impeccably polite about the whole thing, her refined manners unchanged despite her internal decor. And, perhaps the strangest part, she wasn't ostracized. In a court where scandal was currency, the image of a princess gliding delicately through ballrooms, silently terrified of breaking her own imaginary piano, was simply filed under royal quirks. But the fragile absurdity of Alexandra's life pales next to a monarch whose competitive spirit knew no shame or mercy. King Henry VIII once challenged the French king to a wrestling match and lost. Henry VIII, famously larger than life, and, toward the end, just larger, was never one to pass up the chance to prove his manly vigour. In 1520, during the Field of the Cloth of Gold, a lavish summit between England and France, the two kings decided to mix diplomacy with a touch of sportsmanship. Picture the scene. Silk tents, fountains running with wine, thousands of courtiers in their finest attire. And in the middle of it all, the two most powerful men in Europe, rolling around in the grass like teenagers at a county fair. Henry, confident in his strength and size, challenged Francis I of France to a wrestling match. Unfortunately for the English king, Francis was not only taller, but apparently faster, and with a swift move, he threw Henry to the ground. Witnesses gasped. Henry, red-faced and no doubt calculating the odds of starting a war over it, was forced to laugh it off. But the humiliation lingered, tucked somewhere in the same mental drawer where he kept grudges and annulment paperwork. The political talks continued, but one suspects Henry replayed that moment in his mind for years, possibly while plotting revenge via canon. Still, as bruised as his ego might have been, at least he didn't have to spend the night in an ice palace like another unfortunate ruler. Empress Anna of Russia built an ice palace and forced a couple to spend their wedding night in it. Anna Ivanovna, the 18th century Empress of Russia, had a taste for spectacle and cruelty disguised as entertainment. In 1739, she staged one of the most bizarre and chilling punishments in royal history. Offended by a nobleman's behaviour, she ordered him to marry a woman from her court who was considered of low status. But a simple wedding wasn't enough. She constructed an entire palace out of ice on the frozen Neva River. Walls, furniture, even the bed. The bridal suite came complete with ice sculptures and blankets made of more ice. The newlyweds were forced to spend their wedding night there, dressed in furs, but still freezing. Guards ensured they couldn't escape. Temperatures in St. Petersburg that winter plummeted well below zero, and whether the couple survived intact is still debated, though frostbite seems like a certainty. For Anna, it was a grand joke, a courtly prank scaled up to imperial proportions. For the victims, it was probably the longest and coldest night of their lives. And yet, this wasn't even the strangest gift ever bestowed by a monarch. Some royal presents were just unsettling in an entirely different way. Queen Victoria received a dead bat in a glass case. When you imagine a gift for a reigning monarch, you might picture jewel-encrusted tiaras, golden goblets, or rare exotic animals. What you probably wouldn't imagine is a dead bat, preserved in a glass case and presented with all the pomp of a royal tribute. But for Queen Victoria, that's exactly what she received from an anonymous admirer. It wasn't just the oddity of the gift that was striking, it was her reaction. She kept it, displayed it, treated it not as a grotesque miscalculation of taste, but as an intriguing curiosity. This was a queen who appreciated novelty, even if that novelty involved tiny leathery wings and sharp little teeth. One wonders where she placed it. In a private study? On a parlor table to confuse and unnerve guests? Did she ever, in a moment of dry amusement, point to it during tea and remark, "Ah yes, one of my most beloved possessions"? Whatever the case, it says something about her sensibilities that the bat survived in her collection rather than being discreetly disposed of. For Victoria, sentiment and eccentricity often overlapped, and perhaps in that mummified creature she saw some symbol of loyalty, or at least a conversation starter. But if you thought this was strange, wait until you meet a monarch whose favourite pastime was pulling teeth out of people's mouths for fun. Tsar Peter the Great loved dentistry so much, he pulled teeth for fun. Peter the Great of Russia was a reformer, a modernizer, a shipbuilder, and oddly, an amateur dentist. He didn't just dabble in theory, he carried dental tools and would volunteer, sometimes insist, on extracting teeth from anyone who'd let him, and occasionally from those who wouldn't. Nobles, servants, foreign dignitaries, no one was entirely safe from his sudden bursts of dental enthusiasm. He would display his growing collection of extracted teeth with pride, as though it were proof of his medical prowess rather than a catalogue of coerced suffering. There was no anesthesia, of course, just brute force, royal authority, and the vague promise that it was for your own good. For Peter, dentistry wasn't just a skill, it was entertainment. A hands-on hobby in an era when hands-on meant something far more invasive. If you attended court and saw the Tsar approach with that gleam in his eye and a pair of pliers in hand, you'd have to make a quick decision, smile politely, or run. But Peter's penchant for random, unwanted physical contact pales in comparison to a king whose mischief went well beyond the mouth and straight into the bizarre. King Christian VII of Denmark slapped people randomly and practiced sword fights naked. Christian VII's reign in the late 18th century was marked by instability, eccentricity, and behaviour that ranged from awkward to outright alarming. He was known to roam the palace unpredictably, occasionally slapping courtiers, servants, and even foreign visitors, without warning. No one was exempt from his impulsive strikes. Ministers, guards, ambassadors all endured the risk of an unexpected royal smack. But his strangest quirk might have been his penchant for practicing sword fights while entirely naked. The image is as uncomfortable as it is perplexing. The clanging of steel, the echo of bare feet on marble, and the utter bewilderment of anyone unlucky enough to witness this scene. Historians have long debated whether Christian's behavior was the result of mental illness, immaturity, or a deliberate effort to unsettle those around him. Whatever the cause, his reign became a theatre of unpredictability, his personal antics often overshadowing matters of state. And yet, his chaotic energy had nothing on the calculated theatricality of a queen who decided to live out her peasant fantasies in silk. Marie Antoinette had a model farm built at Versailles to pretend to be a peasant. When you think of Marie Antoinette, you probably picture towering wigs, diamonds that could double as doorstops, and the infamous "let them eat cake," which she didn't actually say, but it still clings to her like powdered sugar on a pastry. Yet the Queen of France also nurtured a peculiar obsession with pastoral life. She had a model farm, the Hameau de la Reine, constructed right on the grounds of Versailles. This was no ordinary farm, it was a stage set in the middle of a royal garden. The cottages were charmingly rustic in appearance, but inside they were furnished with all the comforts of aristocracy. Here, Marie and her friends would don simple muslin dresses, tie ribbons in their hair, and pretend to be shepherdesses, milking cows that had been brushed and perfumed beforehand. Real peasants, of course, weren't invited to this pageant of faux simplicity. The Queen wasn't aiming for authenticity. She wanted the aesthetic, the idea of rural life without the mud, hunger, or disease. To her, it was whimsical escapism. To her critics, it was an insult, a sign she was more in love with the fantasy of hardship than concerned with the reality. The irony is that while she played at being a peasant, real peasants were busy starving. But the urge to crown oneself with self-declared titles was not unique to France across the ocean. Another monarch was about to emerge from pure imagination. Emperor Norton I of the United States declared himself Emperor of America. In 1859, San Francisco gained an emperor entirely by his own decree. Joshua Abraham Norton, a failed businessman with a flair for the dramatic, simply declared himself Norton I, Emperor of the United States, and later added, Protector of Mexico for good measure. What's remarkable isn't just the audacity, it's that the city went along with it. Newspapers printed his royal proclamations, which ranged from whimsical to visionary. He once called for a bridge between San Francisco and Oakland, which decades later actually happened. He issued his own currency, which local businesses accepted. He inspected the streets, mediated disputes, and attended public events in full imperial regalia, complete with a plumed hat and a sword. He was beloved not as a ruler in power, but as a ruler in spirit, a living symbol of eccentric charm in a rough, gold-rush city. And unlike most self-declared monarchs, Norton never exploited his subjects. He lived in a modest boarding house, often eating free meals, courtesy of admiring restaurateurs. In a world full of ruthless rulers, Norton's reign was oddly benevolent, though others in history took their ideas about ruling and judgment to a far darker place. King James VI of Scotland suggested witches could be tested by drowning. James VI of Scotland, later James I of England, had a consuming fear of witches, and by consuming, we mean he wrote an entire book on the subject, Demonology. Among his more chilling contributions to the witch-hunting craze was the swimming test. Accused witches would be bound and thrown into water. If they floated, it meant the water, pure and sacred, had rejected them, confirming their guilt. If they sank, they were innocent, though that innocence was often proved posthumously. The method was as absurd as it was lethal, yet it fit neatly into the paranoia of the era. James's obsession wasn't just policy, it was personal. He believed witches had tried to kill him by conjuring storms against his ship during a voyage from Denmark. This fear fueled one of the most brutal witch-hunting periods in British history. And so, in the name of divine justice, terrified villagers watched their neighbors flail in cold water, damned if they floated, doomed if they didn't. Such royal fixations remind us that power in the wrong hands can turn superstition into state-sanctioned terror, but the next monarch on our list preferred starting his mornings with bagpipes instead of drowning trials. Queen Elizabeth II had a personal bagpiper who woke her up every morning. For most people, waking up involves an alarm clock, sunlight through the curtains, or if you're unlucky, a neighbour's leaf blower. For Queen Elizabeth II, it was a man in full Highland dress standing outside her window playing the bagpipes. Every morning at precisely 9 a.m, the royal piper would strike up a 15-minute set, the mournful drone of the pipes rolling over the grounds of whatever residence she was staying in. This tradition dated back to Queen Victoria, who decided that nothing said "good morning" like a Scottish war instrument capable of rattling the bones of anyone within 100 yards. Elizabeth continued it with enthusiasm, whether she was in Balmoral, Windsor, or Buckingham Palace. The piper was their reign, shine, or royal schedule permitting. There's something both regal and faintly absurd about this image. The head of the British monarchy, sipping her morning tea, reviewing state papers, and all the while accompanied by a soundtrack that sounds like a ghost lamenting the loss of its favourite kilt. For visitors and staff, the experience could be disorienting. For the Queen, it was simply tradition. And while bagpipes are loud, they're nothing compared to the sound of an emperor ordering a horse into politics. Emperor Caligula allegedly tried to make his horse a consul of Rome. Caligula's reign is remembered for its decadence, cruelty, and surreal acts of power, and perhaps the most famous of these was his apparent plan to elevate his horse, Incitatus, to the position of consul. According to ancient sources, the emperor lavished the animal with marble stables, an ivory manger, purple blankets, and a collar studded with jewels. Guests invited to dine with Caligula might find the horse seated in a place of honour, served oats mixed with gold flakes. Whether Caligula truly intended to appoint the horse to Rome's highest elected office, or whether this was a calculated insult to the Senate, is still debated. Either way, the message was clear. In his mind, a horse could do the job as well, or better, than the politicians of the day. The absurdity of it has survived 2 millennia, turning Incitatus into one of history's most infamous animals. But if Caligula's delusions of grandeur seem excessive, they're almost modest compared to a king who feared that even human touch could destroy him. King Charles VI of France believed he was made of glass. In the late 14th century, King Charles VI of France began exhibiting strange and troubling behaviour, the most notorious of which was his conviction that he was made entirely of glass. This wasn't a casual metaphor. Charles truly believed that any touch, bump, or sudden movement might shatter him into pieces. He wore specially reinforced clothing, avoided being touched, and sometimes sat for hours without moving to preserve his fragile form. Courtiers were instructed to handle him with extreme care, physically and conversationally. The glass delusion was not unique to Charles. It appears in other cases from medieval Europe, but his was by far the most famous. made more tragic by the fact that it struck a ruling monarch in a time of political instability. His reign was punctuated by bouts of insanity, and the glass episode became a symbol of both his fragility and his kingdom's fractured state. In a way, Charles's paranoia wasn't entirely misplaced in a court full of intrigue. One careless move really could destroy him, politically, if not literally. And speaking of collecting fragile things, the next royal on our list made a hobby of surrounding herself with stuffed, exotic creatures. And not all of them were exactly tasteful. Queen Christina of Sweden collected over 200 stuffed crocodiles, snakes, and other animals. Queen Christina of Sweden was many things fiercely intelligent, famously unconventional, and utterly uninterested in conforming to courtly expectations. But one of her lesser-known quirks was her obsession with collecting stuffed animals. Not the soft, plush kind you'd hand to a child, but actual taxidermied specimens, crocodiles with toothy grins, snakes coiled in permanent threat, birds frozen mid-flight. Her collection numbered over 200 pieces. Enough to turn parts of her palace into something resembling a Renaissance curiosity cabinet or, depending on your perspective, a royal horror show. Visitors might wander into a salon expecting to find velvet chairs and oil paintings, only to be confronted by the glassy stare of a crocodile or the unsettling stillness of a cobra poised to strike. For Christina, this wasn't just about decoration. It was about power and novelty. She loved surrounding herself with rare and exotic objects, perhaps as a statement that she could command the presence of the world's most fearsome creatures, even if they were long dead. And if her choice of decor startled a few diplomats into awkward silences, well, that was probably part of the charm. Still, compared to another ruler whose daily menu was dictated by one single dish, Christina's eccentricity seems almost wholesome. Emperor Franz Joseph of Austria. Ate boiled beef every single day for decades. For Emperor Franz Joseph I, ruler of Austria-Hungary for nearly 70 years, culinary variety was overrated. His lunch, day in and day out, for decades, consisted of boiled beef tafelspitz served with horseradish, applesauce, and potatoes. Court chefs were masters of fine cuisine, yet Franz Joseph's palate was as rigid as his punctuality. He saw his meal not as an indulgence but as a ritual, a daily anchor in a life governed by military precision. Guests at the imperial table quickly learned that while the chandelier sparkled and the uniforms gleamed, the menu was as predictable as the emperor's famously stern demeanor. In an age of gastronomic experimentation, this steadfast devotion to one humble dish became part of his legend. The irony, of course, is that in a palace filled with silver service and gilded dining rooms, the centerpiece was essentially a peasant's meal, albeit one prepared to perfection. But not all rulers embraced such modesty. Some had an appetite for trouble, and one in particular found it hard to resist stealing from his peers. King Farouk of Egypt once stole a pocket watch from Winston Churchill. King Farouk I of Egypt had a reputation as a kleptomaniac with royal immunity. His collection of ill-gotten treasures ranged from small trinkets to luxury items, but perhaps his most audacious theft occurred when he allegedly swiped a pocket watch belonging to none other than Winston Churchill. The theft reportedly took place during a meeting between the two men, where Farouk, ever the charming host, distracted Churchill just long enough to pocket the timepiece. It was a brazen act, the kind of behavior only someone utterly confident in their untouchability would attempt. Farouk's penchant for stealing was so notorious that foreign diplomats were warned to keep an eye and a hand on their belongings during audiences. For Farouk, perhaps it was less about the value of the object and more about the thrill of possession, a private joke played on the powerful. And while Churchill might have been irritated, at least Farouk didn't cap the encounter with a racially inappropriate remark, something another royal on our list did with remarkable shamelessness. Prince Philip once told a British student in China, "If you stay here too long, you'll get slitty eyes." Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, was known for his gaffes, those off-the-cuff remarks that could range from charmingly blunt to eyebrow-raisingly inappropriate. But in 1986, during a visit to China, he delivered one that still echoes in lists of diplomatic blunders. Speaking to a group of British exchange students in the city of Xi'an, he reportedly told one of them, "If you stay here too long, you'll get slitty eyes." It was meant, perhaps, as a joke, but even in the 1982nd, it came across as tone-deaf and racially insensitive. The students laughed awkwardly. The local hosts, used to a certain amount of British eccentricity, kept their composure. Philip, for his part, seemed unconcerned. His defenders often chalked such remarks up to old-school humour, while his critics saw them as a sign of the casual racism embedded in certain corners of the establishment. Either way, the moment became part of the long catalogue of Philipism's quips that might have worked in a private dining room but landed with a thud on the global stage. And yet, in the annals of royal excess, this was still mild compared to a king whose smoking habit could have powered a small chimney factory. King Zog I of Albania smoked up to 200 cigarettes a day. King Zog I of Albania ruled from 1928 to 1939 and lived as if moderation were a foreign concept. His court was a swirl of intrigue, political instability, and a personal habit so extreme it's hard to picture without coughing. He smoked up to 200 cigarettes every single day. That's 10 packs, a near-constant procession of lit tobacco between his fingers from dawn to midnight. Courtiers said he could carry on a conversation, sign documents, and smoke all at once, never losing the rhythm. His paranoia didn't help. Assassination attempts were frequent, and the king often smoked as he paced, scanning the room for threats. The haze of cigarette smoke became as much a part of his image as his formal uniform. Doctors, predictably, were ignored. Zog lived through political exile, war, and enough nicotine intake to fell a lesser mortal, though his reign eventually ended with Italian invasion. But if Zog's pockets were full of cigarette cases, another queen's were filled with something far sweeter and far stickier. Queen Isabella II of Spain kept sugar lumps hidden in her pockets. Queen Isabella II of Spain, who reigned in the mid-19th century, had a sweet tooth that went beyond after-dinner treats. She reportedly carried sugar lumps in her pockets, sneaking them throughout the day like a child hoarding candy. It wasn't just an occasional indulgence, it was a habit, a constant need for a little crystalline pick-me-up. Courtiers sometimes noticed her discreetly fishing into her skirts during audiences, and there were even rumours that she would feed sugar lumps to her favourite animals in the palace gardens. In an era when sugar was still something of a luxury, this habit seemed at once charming and frivolous, especially when contrasted with the political turbulence of her reign. Perhaps it was her way of holding on to small pleasures amid the chaos of coups and exiles. Or perhaps she just liked the way it melted on her tongue during long, boring meetings. Either way, her love for sweet indulgence feels quaint compared to the maritime ingenuity of the next king, who designed a dining table to keep his champagne steady in rough seas. King Edward VII of Britain had a custom-made dining table with a groove for champagne bottles. King Edward VII, known for his love of fine dining and finer drink, faced a uniquely royal problem. how to keep champagne bottles from toppling over during meals aboard his yacht. The solution? Commissioning a special dining table with a built-in groove that snugly held bottles in place no matter how much the ship rolled. It wasn't just a practical innovation, it was a statement. The king's appetite for luxury extended beyond the food and drink to the very furniture that delivered them. This groove ensured that no matter the sea's temperament, his champagne would remain upright and his meal uninterrupted. It's a small detail, but it paints a clear picture of Edward's priorities. Stability for the bubbly above all else. While others worried about navigation or storms, Edward made sure his dinner service was ocean-ready. And yet, for all his careful arrangements, his indulgence feels almost modest compared to another monarch who built an entire fake grotto just to take boat rides indoors. King Ludvig II of Bavaria built a fake grotto in his castle for indoor boat rides. King Ludvig II was not a man for half measures. The fairy tale king of Bavaria is remembered for his extravagant architectural projects, none more whimsical than the artificial Venus grotto in his Linderhof palace. Inspired by Wagnerian opera, Ludwig had a cavern constructed inside the palace grounds, complete with an artificial lake and mood lighting that could shift between colours. He would float across the water in a golden shell-shaped boat, sometimes accompanied by music, sometimes in complete solitude. The grotto was heated in winter, lit with early electric bulbs, and scented to enhance the illusion. It was a theatre for one, a retreat into a fantasy world where he was both ruler and dreamer. For Ludwig, reality was often less appealing than the worlds he could build for himself. But while he played boatman in an underground lagoon, another king in history preferred conversations with far quieter companions, the kind that rooted themselves and never talked back. King George III talked to trees as if they were people. King George III, best known to many as the monarch who lost the American colonies, suffered from recurring bouts of mental illness. During these episodes, his behavior could be erratic, eccentric, and, at times, oddly gentle. One such quirk was his habit of conversing with trees. He would stroll through the palace gardens or the grounds at Windsor and speak to them as if addressing old friends. Accounts suggest he gave them personalities, sometimes even titles, in a kind of leafy court that never argued, betrayed, or rebelled. Some contemporaries mocked him for it, but there's something almost poetic in the image. A troubled king finding solace in silent, steadfast company. To George, perhaps the trees were more reliable than his ministers, more loyal than his subjects, and more enduring than his own reign's stability. Still, the eccentricities of monarchs can take far stranger forms, like the Empress, who washed her hair in a cocktail of brandy and raw eggs. Empress Elizabeth of Austria had her hair washed in a mixture of brandy and raw eggs. Empress Elizabeth of Austria, known as Sisi, was celebrated for her beauty and fiercely determined to preserve it. Her most prized feature was her famously long, flowing hair, which cascaded nearly to her ankles. Maintaining it was a labor-intensive ritual that consumed hours each day. Among her more unusual beauty treatments was having her hair washed in a mixture of brandy and raw eggs. The brandy, she believed, stimulated the scalp and strengthened the roots. The eggs, rich in protein, added shine and softness. It was an extravagant routine, not just for the ingredients, but for the sheer amount of time it required. Ladies-in-waiting were tasked with painstakingly detangling every strand, an operation that could take half a day. The scent of brandy lingered in the air, mingling with the opulence of the palace halls, perhaps giving visitors the impression that the Empress had either been baking or drinking heavily. Sisi's vanity rituals were legendary, but they pale beside the gentle eccentricity of a future British king who held entire conversations with his plants. Prince Charles once admitted, he talks to his plants and believes they respond. Long before he became King Charles III, Prince Charles cultivated a public image as an advocate for the environment and organic farming. His environmentalism was earnest, but it sometimes took on a whimsical edge, most notably his admission that he talks to his plants. Not only that, he claimed they respond. To Charles, speaking to his flowers, vegetables, and shrubs wasn't eccentricity. It was part of a respectful relationship between humans and nature. He would encourage them, comment on their growth, perhaps even apologize for pruning. Critics mocked him for it. Tabloids rolled their eyes, but Charles stood firm, insisting that plants benefit from attention and kindness. Whether it's science, superstition, or simply a prince's personal quirk, the image of the heir to the British throne leaning down to chat with a rosebush is charming in its own way. Still, plant talk feels almost mundane next to an emperor whose scientific curiosity extended to the study of obscure species of goby fish. Emperor Akihito of Japan studied goby fish and published scientific papers about them. Emperor Akihito, before and during his reign, maintained a deep passion for marine biology. His focus? Goby fish small, often overlooked creatures inhabiting shallow coastal waters. Akihito didn't merely dabble, he became an expert, conducting detailed research and co-authoring scientific papers on the taxonomy and classification of gobies. His studies contributed genuinely valuable knowledge to the field, earning him respect from scientists worldwide. This was no vanity project. The emperor would spend hours examining specimens under a microscope, carefully recording observations. In an imperial world often obsessed with ceremony and politics, Akihito carved out space for meticulous scientific pursuit. It's a rare case where a monarch's hobby wasn't just eccentric, but academically significant. Yet for all his scholarly precision, the next royal on our list employed a court entertainer whose skills were, shall we say, considerably less academic and considerably more flatulent. King Louis XIV employed a royal fartist named Lepetoman. The Sun King's court at Versailles was a theatre of spectacle, where music, dance, and art were tools of power. Yet amid the grand operas and glittering balls, Louis XIV also enjoyed a far more earthy form of entertainment. Enter Lepetoman, a man whose singular talent was, quite literally, controlled flatulence. His performances were not crude improvisations, but highly choreographed acts, precise timing, varied tones, and even musical notes. He could mimic cannon fire, perform rhythmic bursts to accompany songs, and allegedly even extinguish candles from a distance. To Louis, this was not just bathroom humor, it was another layer of courtly amusement. A reminder that the palace could be a stage for all talents, no matter how unconventional. Guests would stifle laughter behind fans or handkerchiefs, careful not to offend royal decorum, though it's hard to imagine anyone keeping a straight face. The absurdity of the act was balanced by the fact that if the king enjoyed it, everyone else was obliged to declare it brilliant. But if Louis XIV's sense of humour was a little below the belt, the next monarch on our list combined aristocratic elegance with decidedly bohemian habits. Queen Margratha II of Denmark, chains, smokes and paints under a secret pseudonym. Queen Margratha II of Denmark, a modern monarch with a sharp mind and a creative streak, has two long-standing personal habits that couldn't be more different. First, she is a dedicated chain smoker, often pictured with a cigarette in hand, unbothered by public opinion. Second, She is a talented artist and illustrator, producing artwork for books including Danish editions of The Lord of the Rings under a pseudonym. This duality of habits is intriguing. The disciplined, meticulous painter who also fills her studio with a perpetual haze of tobacco smoke. Her work, once her identity was revealed, surprised critics with its quality. She paints with a bold, vivid style, far from the soft courtly art one might expect from a queen. In a world where monarchs are often defined by public duty, Margretha's unapologetic embrace of private passions feels refreshingly human. Still, her eccentricities are mild compared to a Spanish king who once decided that his face should appear on all 4 suits of a deck of cards. King Alonso XIII of Spain commissioned playing cards featuring his face in all 4 suits. In the early 20th century, King Alonso XIII of Spain turned a humble deck of playing cards into a personal branding exercise. He commissioned a special set where, instead of the traditional kings of hearts, clubs, diamonds, and spades, each card bore his own face. Whether you were holding a royal flush or a losing hand, Alfonso's expression would be there, watching. It was a curious blend of vanity and humour, suggesting either a playful king or one who couldn't bear the thought of sharing symbolic power with fictional monarchs. These cards were not merely decorative, they were fully functional and reportedly used in the royal household. One can imagine the awkwardness of a courtier discarding a card bearing the king's likeness, a small, silent insult in the middle of a game. Alfonso's self-insertion into leisure time was extravagant, but not nearly as strange as another ruler who built an army entirely from men who could double as human lampposts. King Frederick William I of Prussia kept a regiment of extraordinarily tall soldiers, known as the Potsdam Giants. Frederick William I of Prussia, nicknamed the Soldier King, was obsessed with building a powerful military, but his obsession took a very specific and very tall turn. He created an elite regiment of soldiers known as the Potsdam Giants, composed entirely of men well over 6 feet tall. In an age when the average European man was significantly shorter, these towering soldiers were living curiosities as much as military assets. Frederick William would scour his territories and beyond to find suitable recruits, sometimes resorting to bribery, kidnapping, or outright coercion. The king adored his giants, parading them in splendid uniforms and treating them as prized possessions rather than simply soldiers. Ironically, their size made them more impressive on the parade ground than in battle, and they rarely saw real combat. The regiment became both a status symbol and a peculiar personal hobby, one that blended military precision with the eccentricity of collecting rare specimens. Yet for all his disciplined militarism, Frederick William's fixation looks almost quaint next to a Japanese emperor whose devotion to marine life went as far as building an aquarium in his palace. Emperor Hirohito of Japan loved marine biology and kept an aquarium in his palace. Before and during his reign, Emperor Hirohito was deeply invested in marine biology, particularly the study of hydrozoans and other small sea creatures. His passion wasn't a mere passing interest, it was a lifelong pursuit. The emperor kept an aquarium inside the imperial palace, using it not as a decorative feature but as a research facility. Here, he observed marine species up close, studying their life cycles and behavior. His scholarly work was respected in the scientific community, and his papers were published internationally. In many ways, Hirohito balanced 2 worlds, the rigid, symbolic role of emperor and the quiet, methodical world of science. Imagine the contrast: formal audiences with dignitaries in the morning, then hours in the afternoon peering into tanks filled with jellyfish and coral. His aquarium was a reminder that even the most tradition-bound leaders could harbor intensely personal passions. Still, Hirohito's serene hobby is a far cry from the more mischievous antics of a queen whose feathered companion had a foul mouth. Queen Mary I of England had a pet parrot that cursed in Spanish. Queen Mary I, often remembered as Bloody Mary for her persecution of Protestants, had a surprisingly playful side, though it came in the form of a parrot with a questionable vocabulary. This bird was not only colourful in plumage, but also in language, reportedly swearing fluently in Spanish. It's unclear whether Mary taught it these words herself or if it picked them up from members of her court, but either way, the parrot became a minor sensation. Visitors would be startled to hear royal chambers echoing with avian profanity, a jarring soundtrack to the otherwise somber atmosphere of Mary's reign. The parrot's multilingual insults might have amused the Queen, whose own command of Spanish came from her heritage as the daughter of Catherine of Aragon. Still, it's a peculiar image. The stern Queen of England chuckling at a bird hurling curses at unsuspecting courtiers. And if you think a bad-tempered bird is strange, wait until you meet a king whose jawline was so extreme it made chewing a royal challenge. King Charles II of Spain reportedly couldn't chew food properly because of his enormous Habsburg jaw. King Charles II of Spain was the last of the Spanish Habsburgs, and he embodied quite literally the consequences of generations of royal inbreeding. His most striking physical feature was the infamous Habsburg jaw, so pronounced that it severely limited his ability to chew food. The jaw was so elongated and protruding that his lower and upper teeth barely met, making eating a slow, awkward process. This wasn't just a minor inconvenience. It shaped his entire public image. Courtiers would note the king's halting manner at meals, where he often relied on soft foods or had to take unusually small bites. The deformity was paired with numerous health problems, further cementing his reputation as frail and cursed. In a dynasty obsessed with consolidating power through marriage, Charles's condition became a living symbol of the genetic toll such policies could exact. Still, however physically fragile, his quirks were tame compared to another king who amassed a collection of musical instruments as unlikely as it was enormous. King Edward VIII collected over 200 sets of bagpipes. Before he famously abdicated the throne for love, King Edward VIII had already been cultivating a strange and very specific hobby: collecting bagpipes. Not just one or two fine sets, over 200 of them. These instruments came from different regions, each with its own distinctive sound, history, and design. Some were ornate, decorated with silver and ivory, while others were plain and functional. Edward's fascination with them was partly born from his fondness for Scotland, where he spent much time as Prince of Wales. Owning a set of bagpipes is one thing, owning hundreds is another entirely, especially when you don't play them. The collection filled entire rooms, a silent army of tartan bags and wooden chanters. Visitors might have expected to hear them played during gatherings, but more often they simply stood as curiosities, a testament to the king's eclectic tastes. Yet Edward's passion for musical clutter still seems reasonable when compared to a monarch who outright banned one of the world's most popular sports. King Henry VI of England forbade his subjects from playing football. In the 15th century, football, or soccer, as it would later be called, was a rough, chaotic game played in the streets and open fields. It had few rules, no referees, and often descended into violent brawls. King Henry VI, concerned that such distractions were pulling his subjects away from more useful pursuits, namely archery practice, crucial for England's military readiness, decided to ban the sport entirely. His proclamation forbade football under penalty of imprisonment. For Henry, this was about national defence, not fun policing. The longbow was England's battlefield pride, and he feared that idle games would leave the kingdom vulnerable. Whether the ban was strictly enforced is doubtful, but it became part of a centuries-long tug-of-war between authorities and the popular game. Ironically, the very sport Henry tried to suppress would eventually become one of England's most enduring cultural exports. And while banning football may have annoyed commoners, another queen's travel habit would have left them simply baffled, because she brought an entire palace with her wherever she went. Queen Catherine the Great of Russia travelled with a portable, collapsible palace. Catherine the Great was not a woman to travel lightly. When she journeyed across Russia, a land vast enough to make even the most luxurious trek exhausting, she brought with her a marvel of 18th century engineering, a portable, collapsible palace. This was no humble tent. It was a series of richly decorated, modular structures that could be dismantled, packed, and reassembled at her next destination. Walls were hung with silks, floors were carpeted, and there was space for private chambers, meeting rooms, and, naturally, a dining area fit for an empress. Wherever she went, Catherine was surrounded by the same opulence she enjoyed in St. Petersburg. To her, it wasn't just about comfort, it was about projecting imperial authority in even the most remote corners of her empire. The portable palace was a statement. The empress doesn't adapt to the landscape adapts to the empress. But as much as Catherine's travelling home was a spectacle, it was nothing compared to the theatrical and fatal scene that unfolded for one Swedish king. King Gustav III of Sweden was assassinated at a masked ball. King Gustav III's life ended like something out of an opera, which was fitting, given his love for theatre. In 1792, Gustav attended a masked ball in Stockholm, dressed in an elaborate domino costume, a flowing black cloak and mask that made him almost unrecognizable. Almost. His political enemies, conspiring against his increasingly autocratic rule, had chosen this event as the perfect stage for his assassination. In the crowded, candle-lit hall, one conspirator approached and shot him in the back at close range. Remarkably, the king did not die immediately. He lingered for nearly 2 weeks before succumbing to infection. The masked ball became infamous in Swedish history, immortalized in art, and later inspiring Verdi's opera Un ballo in Maschera. Gustav's dramatic end proved that even the most glittering courtly events could turn deadly. But if his death was tragic, another emperor's blunder was far more farcical, ordering devices for executions in a country that didn't even have the means to power them. Emperor Menelik II of Ethiopia ordered 3 electric chairs without having electricity. In the late 19th century, Emperor Menelik II of Ethiopia was eager to modernize his empire. When he learned of the electric chair, a new execution device in the United States, he decided Ethiopia should have some as a mark of progress. So he ordered 3 of them. The problem? Ethiopia didn't have electricity. When the chairs arrived, gleaming with polished wood and metal fittings, there was no way to use them as intended. Rather than let them go to waste, Menelik repurposed at least one as a grand throne. The image is wonderfully absurd. An emperor sitting regally in a device designed for capital punishment, completely unbothered by its grim original purpose. This wasn't just a logistical oversight. It was a perfect example of how modernization without infrastructure can lead to results that are equal parts impressive and ridiculous. And speaking of misplaced royalty, the next king on our list ended up buried in a place far less grand than a palace under a modern parking lot. King Richard III's remains were found buried under a parking lot in 2012. For centuries, the fate of King Richard III's remains was shrouded in mystery. The last Plantagenet King of England was killed at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485, ending both his reign and the Wars of the Roses. Historical accounts suggested he'd been buried in a humble grave at Greyfriars Church in Leicester, but over the centuries, the church vanished. Its location lost. Fast forward more than 500 years. Archaeologists, armed with historical maps and a lot of optimism, began excavating a city parking lot. Against all odds, they uncovered a skeleton with scoliosis, battle wounds, and radiocarbon dating that matched Richard's era. DNA testing confirmed it. The infamous king had been lying under tarmac, cars, and oil stains for decades. The discovery was a bizarre collision of medieval history and modern mundanity, the kind of twist Richard himself might have appreciated. Still, his ignominious burial spot is nothing compared to the strange military orders of a Roman emperor who sent his soldiers to gather seashells. Emperor Caligula once ordered his army to collect seashells as spoils of war. Caligula's reign over Rome was marked by excess, cruelty, and a flair for the absurd. One of his strangest moments came during a military campaign in northern Gaul. Instead of launching an invasion across the Channel, Caligula reportedly assembled his troops on the shore, ordered them to line up, and commanded them to collect seashells. These, he declared, were the spoils of the conquered ocean. The soldiers dutifully complied because refusing an order from Caligula was often fatal, and returned with armfuls of shells, which were then paraded back to Rome as trophies. Historians have long debated whether this was a symbolic act, a mockery of his generals, or simply evidence of a ruler losing touch with reality. Whatever the reason, it stands as one of the most surreal military victories in history. Yet, while Caligula amused himself with shells, a Prussian king was training his dogs to impress at court dinners. King Frederick II of Prussia trained his greyhounds to perform tricks at court dinners. Frederick the Great of Prussia was a celebrated military strategist and enlightened ruler, but he also had a softer side, one reserved for his beloved greyhounds. These sleek, loyal dogs were not only constant companions, but also performers in his courtly theatre. Frederick trained them to execute elaborate tricks, fetching specific items, bowing to guests, even dancing to music played during dinners. Visitors to the royal table could expect a performance that combined military precision with canine charm. The dogs were so well regarded that they were allowed to roam freely in the palace, often lounging beside the king during meetings. In Frederick's eyes, their loyalty and elegance embodied virtues he valued more than the flattery of courtiers. It's a wholesome eccentricity compared to the scandals stirred up when another queen formed a close friendship with an Indian servant. A relationship that rattled the royal establishment. Queen Victoria had a favourite servant who was an Indian man named Abdul Karim. In the final decades of her reign, Queen Victoria's household was upended by the arrival of Abdul Karim, a young clerk from India sent to serve at her Golden Jubilee in 1887. Originally intended to be a mere waiter, Karim quickly caught the Queen's attention with his manners, his language skills, and perhaps most importantly, his lack of fear in speaking to her as an equal. She promoted him rapidly, eventually making him her Munshi teacher in Hindustani and Indian culture. Their relationship was close and deeply resented by many in the court. To Victoria, Karim was a trusted confidant who offered her a window into a part of her empire she would never see firsthand. To her household, he was an interloper who disrupted the rigid social hierarchy. After her death, the royal family moved swiftly to erase evidence of the friendship, destroying letters and sending Karim back to India. But the truth survived in fragments, revealing a queen willing to defy convention in ways that unsettled her own inner circle. That said, not every royal fascination involved human company. Some were just about impressing guests with the most unusual pets imaginable. King Louis XV had a pet moose that he loved showing off to guests. Louis XV's court at Versailles was already a glittering display of opulence, but the king decided to add an unusual flourish: a moose. The animal was gifted to him by Canada, then New France, and became a living curiosity within the palace grounds. Louis delighted in introducing the creature to foreign dignitaries, pointing out its towering antlers and exotic origins. The moose, docile and bewildered by its new surroundings, became a symbol of France's far-reaching colonial connections, though it's hard to say whether the animal appreciated the role. At a court where appearances mattered more than practicality, the king's pet served as a kind of diplomatic icebreaker, albeit one that occasionally chewed on the landscaping. Yet for all its novelty, the moose was a tame indulgence compared to the queen who once put her guests' nerves and her own driving skills to the test. Queen Elizabeth II once drove a Saudi Arabian prince around Balmoral at high speed. In 1998, during a visit to Balmoral Castle, Queen Elizabeth II hosted Crown Prince Abdullah of Saudi Arabia. At the time, Saudi Arabia prohibited women from driving, making what happened next both unexpected and pointed. After lunch, the Queen offered to give the prince a tour of the estate and then personally took the driver's seat of a Land Rover. According to later accounts, she set off at considerable speed along the narrow, winding roads, all while continuing to chat and gesture to sights along the way. The prince, unused to both female drivers and such spirited driving, reportedly asked her interpreter to tell the Queen to slow down. Whether she did so to make a quiet political statement or simply to indulge her love of driving, the moment has become legendary. It was a perfect example of Elizabeth's understated wit, the kind that makes you wonder just how many other royal traditions were punctuated with a sly grin. The next king in our list, however, preferred his companions to be the sort who could scamper across the table. King William IV of Britain kept a pet monkey named Jacko who dined at the royal table. King William IV's reign was short but colourful, and much of that colour came from his unorthodox approach to courtly life. Among his more memorable quirks was his pet monkey, Jacko, who enjoyed privileges few animals and perhaps even few humans could boast: a seat at the royal dining table. Jacko was not merely present, he was treated as a guest, reportedly served delicacies and allowed to roam freely among the silverware and crystal. For visitors, the sight of the king calmly conversing with a small, furry creature while nobles tried to keep a straight face was both amusing and disconcerting. William had a fondness for animals in general, but Jacko was special, a daily reminder that the king's sense of companionship was not bound by human convention. In an era when monarchy was expected to project rigid decorum, William's dining arrangements suggested a ruler who valued comfort and amusement over strict etiquette. Still, his attachment to Jacko seems modest compared to the emperor who surrounded himself with more books than many universities. Emperor Akbar of India kept a personal library of over 24,000 books. Emperor Akbar, the third ruler of the Mughal Empire, was famously illiterate, but that didn't stop him from amassing one of the most impressive libraries of his age. His personal collection contained more than 24,000 books, covering subjects as diverse as religion, astronomy, poetry, law, and philosophy. The emperor had each work read aloud to him by scholars and scribes, and he engaged deeply with the ideas they contained. This habit was both a personal passion and a political tool, as Akbar sought to unite his vast multicultural empire through knowledge and dialogue. His court became a center of intellectual exchange, with debates and discussions that crossed religious and cultural boundaries. The library itself was a symbol of imperial grandeur, its manuscripts bound in rich fabrics and decorated with intricate calligraphy. While Akbar's book obsession was rooted in the mind, the next king in our line put his energy into a much more visible form of self-enhancement, quite literally adding inches to his height. King Charles I of England was only 5'4" tall, but wore 6-inch heels to appear taller. King Charles I was not a physically imposing man. Standing at just 5 feet 4 inches, he was shorter than many of his contemporaries, and in an age when height was often associated with authority, he sought to correct the imbalance through fashion. His solution? Wearing shoes with heels up to 6 inches high. These were not subtle lifts, but ornate, attention-grabbing footwear that, combined with his elaborate court dress, made him appear taller and more commanding. The style was fashionable among the elite, but for Charles, it was more than a trend. It was a deliberate projection of power. The towering shoes complemented his carefully groomed appearance and regal bearing, creating a presence that belied his actual stature. Yet while Charles used clothing to elevate himself, another queen found a way to turn clothing itself into a spectacle, crafting an entire gown out of something normally destined for the card table. Queen Caroline of Ansbach once wore a dress made entirely out of playing cards. Queen Caroline of Ansbach, consort to King George II of Britain, had a keen political mind and a flair for the dramatic. But one of her more memorable fashion statements came in the form of a dress that would have made any professional gambler weep. It was made entirely out of playing cards. Each card was sewn together to form panels, the suits and numbers, creating a bizarre patchwork of red and black patterns. While the gown was certainly not practical for sitting, walking, or perhaps even breathing comfortably, it served its purpose: to attract attention and provoke conversation. The gesture may have been whimsical, but it also fit neatly into the 18th century tradition of symbolic dressing, perhaps a sly nod to the game of politics or to fortune's role in royal life. The outfit might have drawn laughter, admiration, or confusion, but it undoubtedly made her the centerpiece of the room. And if you think that's a peculiar way for a monarch to express themselves, the next king on our list took his public health beliefs to an even stranger extreme. King George IV tried to ban potatoes from Britain because he thought they caused leprosy. King George IV's reign was filled with indulgences, fashion excess, and occasional bursts of questionable judgment, but perhaps none stranger than his suspicion of potatoes. He reportedly believed that eating potatoes could cause leprosy, an idea without any basis in medical science even at the time. Motivated by this belief, he attempted to discourage or outright ban the vegetable in Britain. The reasoning might have come from misinterpreted colonial reports or hearsay, but the result was the same: bafflement from the public and bemusement from his advisors. Potatoes were already a staple food for many, and his opposition to them came off as wildly out of touch. His campaign never succeeded, of course, but it remains a curious footnote in the history of royal eccentricity. And while George's potato paranoia was odd, it was still less confrontational than the time a princess insulted a world-famous actress's engagement ring to her face. Princess Margaret once insulted Elizabeth Taylor's engagement ring and got shown up. Princess Margaret, younger sister of Queen Elizabeth II, was famous for her wit, her glamour, and her ability to be cutting without hesitation. At a party in 1969, she encountered Hollywood legend Elizabeth Taylor, who was wearing an enormous diamond engagement ring from Richard Burton. Margaret, with a trademark mix of charm and bite, reportedly said, "That's a bit vulgar, isn't it?" Taylor, unfazed, smiled and shot back by holding the ring up and replying, "Yes, but it's not as vulgar as what's going on in your mouth, darling." The comeback was lethal and immediate. Guests either stifled their gasps or laughed outright, depending on their courage. The exchange has become one of the most memorable social skirmishes between royalty and celebrity, proving that when it came to verbal duels, Margaret had finally met her match. Still, an icy reception at a party is one thing. The next emperor on our list made sure he always won in public competitions, even if it meant bending the rules beyond recognition. Emperor Nero allegedly competed in the Olympics and won every event by threatening the judges. Emperor Nero's relationship with sports was less about athleticism and more about imperial theatre. When he took part in the Olympic Games in Greece in 67 AD, he wasn't content to simply attend as a spectator. Instead, he entered multiple competitions, chariot racing, singing, poetry recitals, and athletic events, and somehow emerged victorious in all of them. The somehow wasn't exactly mysterious. The judges knew better than to risk offending the most powerful man in Rome. Even when Nero famously fell from his chariot during one race and failed to finish, he was still awarded first place. His victories were celebrated with pomp and ceremony, though they were as hollow as a gilded statue with no marble core. For Nero, the games were just another stage, an opportunity to drape himself in laurels and bask in the applause, however coerced. And if winning through intimidation sounds absurd, it's nothing compared to a king who once expressed his love by gifting his wife a live monkey. King Henry VIII once gave Anne Boleyn a live monkey as a romantic gift. King Henry VIII's courtship of Anne Boleyn is usually remembered for its political intrigue, lavish jewels, and passionate letters. But amid the courtly drama, there was also a peculiar present, a live monkey. At the time, exotic animals were symbols of status and wealth, and Henry likely meant the gift to impress. Still, one wonders what Anne's actual reaction was when confronted with a chattering, unpredictable primate in her chambers. Such pets required constant care, specialized diets, and a tolerance for the occasional destructive outburst. Whether Anne genuinely enjoyed the gift or merely smiled graciously at the king's gesture is unknown, but the monkey stands as one of the strangest tokens of affection in royal history. And if Henry's idea of romance was unconventional, his wife's successor on our list embraced exoticism even more fully in the form of a very fashionable, four-legged palace resident. Queen Charlotte kept a zebra at Buckingham Palace as a pet. In the late 18th century, Queen Charlotte, wife of King George III, received a zebra as a gift from South Africa. The animal became an instant sensation in London, attracting crowds eager to catch a glimpse of the striped horse grazing in the palace gardens. Zebras were rare and mysterious to Europeans at the time, and Charlotte's pet was a living symbol of Britain's global reach during the Age of Empire. The zebra, however, was less interested in symbolism and more in simply existing, often startling horses and humans alike with its unfamiliar appearance. Artists captured its likeness in paintings, further cementing its place in the visual history of the royal household. While today it might seem odd to keep such a wild creature as a pet, in Charlotte's era it was the ultimate conversation piece. Still, Her fondness for the exotic was a gentle eccentricity compared to the emperor, who demanded an entire palace modification to satisfy his sweet tooth. Emperor Franz Joseph loved ice cream so much that a special freezer was built at Schönbrunn Palace just for him. In the 19th century, before refrigeration was a household convenience, ice cream was a luxury that required careful planning and infrastructure. For Emperor Franz Joseph of Austria, whose tastes were usually conservative, ice cream was a rare indulgence he adored so much that he had a dedicated freezer installed at Schönbrunn Palace. This was no ordinary icebox. It was a large, purpose-built storage space designed to keep ice cream at the perfect consistency year-round. Ice harvested in winter from nearby lakes and rivers was stored in insulated pits, allowing the palace kitchen to prepare the emperor's favorite frozen desserts even in the heat of summer. Franz Joseph's ice cream habit was so well known that guests sometimes brought exotic flavor suggestions as tokens of goodwill, though he reportedly preferred simple, classic varieties. In a court famous for its strict formality, the freezer became an unlikely symbol of personal indulgence, a hidden luxury behind all the Habsburg ceremony. But while Franz Joseph's passion for dessert was endearing, the next king on our list took indulgence to an extreme that made his breakfast table look like a small feast for an army. King Farouk of Egypt once ordered 30 fried eggs for breakfast. King Farouk's appetites, political, material, and culinary, were legendary. But few anecdotes capture his excess like his habit of ordering 30 fried eggs for breakfast. It wasn't necessarily that he ate them all himself. Rather, it was about abundance, the pleasure of having far more than needed simply because he could. Farouk's dining habits reflected his broader approach to life, lavish, impulsive, and completely unconcerned with moderation. His breakfast table might also include pastries, meats, and rich Egyptian coffee, turning the morning meal into a display of royal opulence. Whether the eggs were shared with guests or staff remains unclear, but the sheer number spoke volumes about his indulgence. Compared to Farouk's culinary excess, the delusions of the next queen on our list seem almost tragic, a belief in a divine pregnancy that never existed. Queen Mary. I believed the baby she was pregnant with was divine, but she wasn't pregnant at all. In 1554, Queen Mary I of England, desperate for an heir to secure the Catholic succession, announced that she was pregnant. Her swelling abdomen, cessation of menstruation, and other symptoms seemed to confirm it. Mary believed and may have proclaimed that the child was divinely blessed, a symbol of God's favor upon her reign. Court celebrations were planned, and the nation waited for the royal birth. But months passed, and no child arrived. It became clear that Mary's pregnancy had been a false one, likely the result of a medical condition such as a tumor or phantom pregnancy. The humiliation was profound. For a queen already battling political unrest and religious division, the failure to produce an heir deepened her unpopularity. This sad episode became one of the defining personal tragedies of her reign. And yet, while Mary's belief was rooted in hope, the king who follows her in our list found joy in something far more mechanical, tinkering with locks like a royal locksmith. King Louis XVI loved locksmithing and spent hours tinkering with locks. Long before his fateful meeting with the guillotine, King Louis XVI of France was better known in some circles for his peculiar hobby, locksmithing. In the grand halls of Versailles, the king could often be found tucked away in a small workshop, hunched over metal parts, files, and springs, crafting locks and keys with meticulous care. This was no passing amusement, Louis was genuinely skilled, and he worked alongside professional locksmith Francois Gamin, discussing designs and mechanisms with the enthusiasm of an artisan. His fascination with the craft was so absorbing that courtiers sometimes joked he'd have been happier as a tradesman than as king. There's an irony here. A monarch so engrossed in creating devices meant to secure things ultimately proved unable to safeguard his own crown. And while Louis quietly turned keys in his workshop, the queen who preceded him by 2 centuries was coating her face in something far less practical and far more poisonous. Queen Elizabeth I allegedly had lead-based makeup applied so thickly that cracks had to be painted over. Elizabeth I's striking pale complexion became one of her most iconic features, but maintaining it came at a cost. The Queen used a cosmetic called Venetian ceruse, a mixture of white lead and vinegar, to achieve her alabaster skin. Layer upon layer was applied until her face appeared flawlessly smooth, but the toxic mixture caused severe skin damage over time. To hide the resulting blemishes and scarring, Elizabeth applied the makeup even more thickly, sometimes to the point where it would crack. When that happened, attendants reportedly painted over the fissures to maintain the illusion of perfection. In an age when appearance was inseparable from authority, the Queen's painted mask became a literal armor, hiding both her flaws and the toll of her reign. Yet for all her calculated image control, the next emperor on our list built his reputation not on appearances, but on an almost unbelievable act of religious devotion multiplied tens of thousands of times. Emperor Ashoka of India reportedly built 84,000 stupas to store relics of Buddha. Ashoka the Great, who ruled the Maurya Empire in the 3rd century BCE, underwent a profound transformation after witnessing the horrors of war. Embracing Buddhism, he dedicated himself to spreading the faith across his vast territory. One of the most extraordinary and possibly exaggerated accounts of his devotion claims that he built 84,000 stupas, each to house relics of the Buddha. While the exact number is likely symbolic, the construction of even a fraction of that total would have been an enormous logistical feat, requiring vast resources and labor. These stupas served as both religious monuments and political symbols, reinforcing Ashoka's role as a righteous ruler. The scale of his project, whether entirely factual or partially legendary, reflects a ruler whose ambitions reached beyond earthly power into the realm of spiritual legacy. Still, while Ashoka's undertakings were rooted in faith, the next king's grand decree was rooted firmly in self-promotion and a touch of vanity. King Charles IX of France ordered that all newborns be named after him for an entire year. In 1566, King Charles IX of France decided to leave his mark on the kingdom in an unusual way by stamping his name into the very identities of its newest citizens. He issued an edict declaring that for 1 full year, all newborn boys must be named Charles, and all girls Charlotte. The reasoning behind this decree is murky. Perhaps it was a bid to cement his legacy. Perhaps a royal whim gone unchecked, or perhaps a calculated show of absolute authority over even the most personal choices. Whatever the motive, the result must have been chaotic. Imagine entire towns filled with little Charleses and Charlottes, households shouting the same name at multiple children, and priests struggling to record baptismal details without confusion. It's doubtful the edict had any lasting cultural effect, but for that year, France must have felt like one extended family reunion where everyone shares the same name. While Charles IX was busy renaming his people, a Japanese emperor was scandalizing his own traditionalists by embracing a foreign culinary delight. Emperor Meiji of Japan loved eating beef so much. It scandalized traditionalists. In the late 19th century, Emperor Meiji oversaw Japan's rapid modernization, adopting Western technologies, fashions, and customs. Among these imported habits was eating beef, a food long avoided in Japan due to Buddhist influence and the cultural association of cattle with agricultural labor. When Meiji first publicly dined on beef, it made headlines across the country. Some saw it as a sign of progress, a symbolic break from centuries-old dietary restrictions. Others viewed it as a dangerous abandonment of tradition. Undeterred, Meiji continued to enjoy beef dishes, making them part of his regular meals. This royal preference trickled down into society, gradually normalizing the consumption of meat among the Japanese population. What began as a personal taste became a cultural turning point. And while Meiji's choice influenced a nation's diet, the next king on our list commissioned furniture with a far more private and risque purpose. King Edward VII had a custom-made chair for his mistresses during romantic encounters. King Edward VII's reputation as a ladies' man was well earned, and his private life was filled with liaisons that were both numerous and well known within elite circles. Ever practical in his indulgences, Edward had a special chair designed for use during his romantic encounters. This piece of furniture was engineered to accommodate his considerable size and ensure comfort and convenience for both him and his partners. The design reportedly allowed for certain physical activities without putting strain on his body, a blend of intimacy and ergonomic ingenuity. It was an object that spoke volumes about Edward's unapologetic pursuit of pleasure and his ability to command custom craftsmanship for even the most personal aspects of life. While the chair remained hidden from public view, its existence became part of the whispered lore surrounding the king's private habits. Yet Edward could also be regal in the traditional sense, as seen when his royal messages reached as far as the surface of the moon. Queen Elizabeth II sent a congratulatory telegram to Apollo 11 astronauts on the moon. In July 1969, as the world watched Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin take humanity's first steps on the moon, Queen Elizabeth II decided that the moment warranted a royal touch. She sent a message of congratulations to the astronauts, not by ordinary post of course, but etched on a tiny silicon disc that was left on the lunar surface. The disc contained goodwill messages from leaders around the world, preserved in the moon's dust for potentially millions of years. Her contribution was brief but dignified, a reminder that even in the midst of the Cold War space race, there was room for a quiet note of unity. The gesture was symbolic, but also faintly amusing. The monarch of a realm that had once measured power by how many oceans it commanded, now sending greetings to men walking in a place where oceans were nothing but ancient scars. Yet while Elizabeth's message was one of diplomacy and grace, the emperor who follows her in our list was more interested in dressing his pet monkey in tiny uniforms. Emperor Maximilian of Mexico kept a pet spider monkey that wore little uniforms. Maximilian I of Mexico, installed as emperor in 1864 with the backing of Napoleon III, was a man of contradictions, a European aristocrat trying to rule in a land where his authority was always tenuous. Perhaps as a distraction from political instability, he lavished affection on his pet spider monkey, named Pepe. Pepe wasn't merely a palace mascot. He was dressed in custom-made uniforms, complete with miniature epaulettes and hats, turning him into a furry parody of a military officer. Visitors to the court were alternately charmed and bemused, unsure whether to salute the creature or suppress their laughter. While the empire crumbled around him, Maximilian seemed to find solace in this bizarre companionship. Still, at least his antics were harmless, unlike the Spanish king who followed, whose idea of humor involved causing literal discomfort to his guests. King Alfonso XIII loved practical jokes and once placed itching powder in guests' beds. King Alfonso XIII of Spain had a mischievous streak that often blurred the line between harmless fun and royal cruelty. One of his favourite pranks was to slip itching powder into the beds of unsuspecting guests. The powder, once it came into contact with skin, caused intense irritation, making sleep nearly impossible. Imagine the diplomatic awkwardness of foreign dignitaries scratching furiously through the night in the royal palace, too polite to complain in the morning. Alfonso reportedly found this hilarious, relishing the quiet chaos his prank created. Such antics might have been tolerated in a university dormitory, but in a royal court they were both shocking and oddly telling. This was a monarch who saw himself not just as a ruler, but as the perpetual trickster at the centre of his own elaborate comedy. And while itching powder was a petty inconvenience, the Queen next on our list imposed a rule that literally stopped people in their tracks. Queen Victoria had a strict rule that no one could walk in front of her, even in hallways. Queen Victoria's reign was defined by ceremony, protocol, and a sharp sense of personal authority. One of her lesser-known but rigidly enforced rules was that no one, under any circumstance, could walk in front of her. This wasn't just for formal events. The rule applied in the palace hallways, gardens, and even during casual strolls. If Victoria was on the move, everyone else had to either keep behind her or move to the side until she passed. The origin of the rule is unclear. It may have been about maintaining the dignity of her position, or perhaps it was simply her way of reminding those around her who held the power. Servants, courtiers, and even foreign dignitaries learned quickly to navigate this peculiar form of etiquette, sometimes making awkward sidesteps or sudden halts mid-conversation. For Victoria, it wasn't negotiable, it was a visible, daily reinforcement of her status. Yet her love of order contrasts sharply with the king who follows her in our list, whose collection brought an air of the wild to his court. King James I of England kept a collection of exotic animals, including crocodiles and camels. King James I, the first monarch to rule both England and Scotland, was fascinated by the exotic and the unusual. Among his many indulgences was a menagerie of animals rarely seen in Europe at the time: crocodiles, camels, and other creatures brought from far-off lands. These animals were housed in royal estates and displayed to visitors as living proof of the kingdom's global reach. For James, they were symbols of both prestige and curiosity, connecting his court to distant territories and trade routes. The menagerie also served as entertainment, though one suspects the animals themselves were less enthusiastic about their role in royal spectacle. In an age when the world still felt vast and mysterious, such collections were a powerful statement. The king commanded not just people, but the wonders of nature itself. Yet, for all James's fascination with the exotic, the queen who follows him on our list preferred to shed the trappings of her station entirely, and even her dresses. Queen Christina of Sweden once abdicated, moved to Rome, and refused to wear dresses. Queen Christina of Sweden's reign was as unconventional as her personal life. After ruling from 1632 to 1654, she shocked Europe by abdicating her throne at the age of 28, converting to Catholicism and relocating to Rome. But even more shocking to the deeply gendered society of the 17th century was her decision to abandon traditional female dress altogether. Christina preferred men's clothing, both for comfort and as a statement of identity, and she wore it openly in public. Her attire was more than a personal quirk. It was a deliberate rejection of the rigid expectations placed upon her as a woman and as a former queen. In Rome, She became a patron of the arts and a notorious social figure, charming and confounding everyone she met. Christina's disregard for convention was absolute, making her one of history's most unapologetically independent royals. And yet, for all her defiance, the next king on our list took attachment to an animal to an entirely different and pocket-sized level. King Henry III of France carried his pet marmoset with him everywhere. In the 16th century, King Henry III of France stood out not just for his elaborate fashion and political intrigue, but for his constant companion, a tiny marmoset. This little monkey was more than a pet. It was a fixture of the king's public and private life. Perched on his shoulder, or tucked into the folds of his luxurious robes, the marmoset accompanied Henry to audiences, council meetings, and even religious ceremonies. The king doted on it, feeding it treats and ensuring it was adorned with ribbons or miniature collars. Courtiers sometimes found themselves addressing both monarch and monkey in the same breath, unsure where to direct their attention. For Henry, the animal was perhaps a comfort in a life of constant political tension and assassination threats. Still, his devotion to this pocket-sized primate feels quaint compared to the vision problems of the next emperor, whose eyesight was so poor it occasionally led to awkward diplomatic moments. Emperor Taisho of Japan was so nearsighted he sometimes saluted the wrong person. Emperor Taisho, who reigned in Japan from 1912 to 1926, was known for his physical frailty and poor health, which included severe nearsightedness. In the highly formalized setting of imperial ceremonies, this created a recurring problem. He would occasionally salute the wrong person. Military parades and official receptions depended on precise gestures of recognition from the emperor. Yet Taisho's limited vision sometimes meant a bow or salute went to a random soldier, aide, or bystander instead of the intended dignitary. In a society where protocol was everything, these small misfires were both awkward and oddly humanizing. Courtiers learned to discreetly correct him or subtly guide his line of sight, but the occasional misplaced salute became a quiet inside joke in the palace. And while Taisho's vision caused these harmless errors, the next king in our list had a different obsession, one that could be measured not in optics, but in baskets of strawberries. King Edward IV was obsessed with strawberries and ate them in huge quantities. King Edward IV of England, a towering figure in both stature and political ambition, had a surprisingly simple culinary weakness: strawberries. He adored them in such quantities that they became a fixture of his diet whenever they were in season. Servants were tasked with sourcing the freshest berries from across the kingdom, and they would arrive at court in great baskets, their sweet aroma filling the air. Edward would eat them plain, with cream, or as part of elaborate desserts. This fondness was well known, and it's said that courtiers sometimes used strawberry-themed gifts or feasts to curry favour. The fruit's fleeting season meant that for much of the year, Edward had to wait impatiently for their return, a reminder that even a king's desires were bound by the rhythms of nature. While his strawberry fixation was harmless enough, the next queen endured a far more tragic and relentless cycle, one that repeated itself 17 times with heartbreaking results. Queen Anne of Great Britain was pregnant at least 17 times, but only one child survived infancy. Queen Anne's reign is remembered for political milestones like the Act of Union in 1707, but her personal life was overshadowed by profound tragedy. Over the course of her marriage to Prince George of Denmark, Anne experienced at least 17 pregnancies. Of these, several ended in miscarriage or stillbirth, and most of the children who were born alive died within hours, days, or months. Only one child, Prince William, Duke of Gloucester, survived beyond infancy, and he died at the age of 11 from suspected hydrocephalus. The repeated losses devastated Anne physically and emotionally, leaving her in chronic ill health for much of her adult life. The court, bound by formality, rarely acknowledged the depth of her grief, but it was a constant shadow over her reign. Her inability to produce a surviving heir eventually led to the end of the Stuart dynasty. Compared to the political theatrics of other monarchs, Anne's story is a reminder of the deeply human suffering that even crowns cannot protect against. Still, her misfortune contrasts sharply with the next emperor on our list, who stepped down not out of tragedy, but to avoid a rather embarrassing social faux pas. Emperor Go-Mizunoo of Japan abdicated to avoid apologizing for a tea ceremony. Faux pas. In the rigidly codified world of Japan's imperial court, even the smallest breach of etiquette could cause a scandal. Emperor Go-Mizunoo, who reigned in the early 17th century, found himself in such a situation after a tea ceremony hosted by the powerful Tokugawa shogunate. Details vary, but the offense, perhaps taking tea in the wrong order or failing to follow a precise ritual, was enough to cause diplomatic strain. Rather than offer a formal apology, Go-Mizunoo took the extraordinary step of abdicating the throne in favor of his daughter. In the context of Japanese politics, this maneuver allowed him to save face while sidestepping the humiliation of admitting fault. It's an almost comically grand solution to a minor social blunder, a royal version of flipping the board when you're losing a game. Yet if Go-Mizunoo's decision was about avoiding embarrassment, the next king in our sequence fully embraced excess, commissioning a birthday cake large enough to make even the most seasoned court bakers sweat. King George IV once commissioned a giant, 9-foot-tall cake for his birthday and ate most of it himself. King George IV never shied away from indulgence, and his birthday celebrations were no exception. On one occasion, he ordered a cake that stood a staggering 9 feet tall, an edible monument to his appetite and love of grandeur. Crafted by the royal kitchen, it was decorated with elaborate sugar sculptures, intricate icing patterns, and tiers upon tiers of rich sponge. The cake was not just a dessert, it was a statement piece, a centerpiece for a banquet that could feed dozens. But according to accounts, George himself ate the majority of it over the course of the festivities. His voracious consumption was matched only by his delight in showing off the confection to his guests before cutting into it with theatrical flair. In an age when sugar was still a luxury for most, the king's towering dessert was both a display of wealth and a testament to his unapologetic self-indulgence. And while George devoured sweets, another monarch on our list was taking equally unusual care of her teeth, though her methods were far from conventional. Queen Elizabeth I used to have her teeth cleaned with a mixture of honey and crushed brick. In an age before modern dentistry, dental care often meant choosing between methods that were ineffective and those that were actively harmful. Queen Elizabeth I, famous for her sharp intellect and even sharper political instincts, was far less successful when it came to oral hygiene. She reportedly had her teeth cleaned with a paste made from honey and finely crushed brick. The honey gave the mixture a pleasant sweetness and sticky consistency, while the brick served as an abrasive to scrub away surface stains. Unfortunately, this scrubbing also wore down enamel over time, leaving teeth more vulnerable to decay. By the later years of her reign, Elizabeth's teeth had darkened considerably, and she was often self-conscious about smiling in public. Ironically, the regimen intended to preserve her royal image ended up hastening its decline. Still, her risky approach to dental care seems almost tame compared to the Albanian king who followed in our list, a man who responded to an assassination attempt in a way that would have made any action hero proud. King Zog I of Albania returned fire when assassins attacked him while eating dinner. King Zog of VI's reign over Albania in the early 20th century was marked by political instability, but few moments were as dramatic as the time he was targeted by assassins during a meal. The king was dining in public when gunmen opened fire. Rather than ducking for cover or relying solely on his guards, Zog drew his own pistol and returned fire across the table. The scene must have been pure chaos, plates shattering, guests scrambling, waiters fleeing, yet the king remained composed enough to shoot back. This brazen self-defense became part of his legend, a testament to both his personal courage and his refusal to be intimidated. It also reinforced his image as a ruler who was never truly off duty, even when enjoying a plate of food. While Zog's quick draw was deadly serious, the next queen in our sequence preferred to surround herself with company of a far gentler sort, one that bleated rather than plotted. Queen Victoria had a pet goat that followed her everywhere at Balmoral. Queen Victoria's fondness for animals is well documented, but among her many pets, one of the most charming was a goat that accompanied her around the Balmoral estate in Scotland. This goat wasn't just a pasture animal, it was a constant companion, trotting along during her walks and even appearing in some royal processions. The sight of the queen small, dignified, and dressed in black, followed closely by a loyal goat, must have been endearing to her Scottish neighbours and bewildering to foreign visitors. For Victoria, the animal likely represented a connection to the simplicity and ruggedness of rural life, a contrast to the rigid etiquette of court. Balmoral was her escape from London's formality, and her goat, in its own way, was part of that retreat. Still, while her choice of pet was rustic and wholesome, the next emperor we'll meet found joy not in the countryside, but in the animated worlds of a certain American mouse. Emperor Hirohito loved Disney cartoons and collected Mickey Mouse memorabilia. Emperor Hirohito of Japan is often remembered for his role during World War II and the profound transformation of Japan in the post-war era, but tucked away in his personal life was a lighter, almost childlike passion: Disney cartoons. In particular, Hirohito had a fondness for Mickey Mouse. Over the years, he amassed a collection of Mickey-themed items, figurines, toys, and other memorabilia that contrasted sharply with the formal image expected of an emperor. The affection was genuine, not just a diplomatic nod to American culture. It said he enjoyed watching the animated shorts, appreciating both their artistry and the humor. For a man burdened with centuries of imperial tradition and the weight of political transformation, Mickey Mouse may have been a small escape, a world where troubles could be resolved in 7 minutes and everyone lived happily ever after. But while Hirohito's fantasy world was drawn in ink and paint, the next king on our list created his own private fantasy, a dining table that moved like magic. King Ludvig II of Bavaria dined alone at a table that revolved to bring him new courses without servants present. King Ludvig II, already renowned for his fairy tale castles and eccentric habits, took his preference for solitude to new heights, or rather, new rotations. At one of his residences, he had a dining table designed to disappear through the floor, only to return moments later laden with the next course. This Tischlein Deg Day, little table, set yourself, mechanism allowed Ludwig to avoid the presence of servants during meals, maintaining an air of isolation and privacy. Guests, when he allowed them, would experience the same surreal service. Dishes appearing and vanishing without a human hand in sight. The concept was part engineering marvel, part theatre, and entirely Ludwig, a man who blurred the line between royal life and operatic fantasy. Yet even his rotating banquet table seems polite compared to the temper of the queen who follows, a monarch whose argument-ending tactic involved airborne stationery. Queen Isabella II of Spain once threw an ink bottle at a courtier during an argument. Queen Isabella II's reign was turbulent, and so, it seems, was her temper. Known for her impulsive nature, she was not above dramatic displays of anger. On one occasion, in the middle of a heated argument with a courtier, she grabbed the nearest object, an ink bottle, and hurled it at him. Whether she aimed to make a point or simply vent her frustration, the act left a literal mark, splattering ink across fine clothes and probably a few egos. Such behavior shocked the more formal members of her court, but it was entirely in keeping with Isabella's unpredictable style of rule. For her, maintaining authority sometimes meant reminding people abruptly and messily who held the power. While this outburst was fueled by passion, the next king in our list enforced his will through a much quieter, almost comical, royal decree about footwear. King Charles VI of France banned anyone from wearing shoes that made noise. King Charles VI of France, the same ruler once convinced he was made of glass, had a sharp sensitivity to sound, so much so that he issued a royal decree forbidding anyone at court from wearing shoes that made noise. In the late 14th and early 15th centuries, fashionable footwear often included metal-tipped soles or hard leather that clicked across stone floors, announcing the wearer's presence long before they entered a room. To Charles, this wasn't charming, it was intolerable. The order likely stemmed from his frequent bouts of mental illness, which made him particularly irritable and sensitive to sensory disturbances. Courtiers, already adept at navigating his unpredictable moods, quickly adapted, switching to softer-soled shoes or walking more carefully to avoid the king's ire. The result must have been eerie. The great halls of the French court, usually alive with a constant clatter, suddenly hushed except for the whisper of fabric and the murmur of voices. And yet, Charles's decree feels almost civilized compared to the exotic pet choices of the queen who follows him in our list. Queen Marie of Romania kept a pet lion cub in her palace. Queen Marie of Romania, granddaughter of Queen Victoria and wife of King Ferdinand I, was a striking figure in early 20th century Europe, beautiful, politically savvy, and unabashedly flamboyant. Among her many eccentricities was keeping a lion cub as a pet. The animal roamed parts of the royal residence, a living testament to Marie's adventurous spirit and perhaps her taste for the dramatic. Guests visiting the palace could be treated to the startling sight of a young lion padding across a polished marble floor or lounging near a fireplace. Though the cub was likely well cared for, it still possessed the instincts of a wild predator, making the arrangement a delicate balance of trust and danger. Marie's fondness for the animal reflected her romantic, almost theatrical sense of life, a sensibility also captured in her writings and public persona. Still, keeping a lion, however young, pales in sheer oddity compared to the next emperor's sideburns, which achieved fame in their own right. Emperor Franz Joseph had sideburns so famous they were nicknamed imperial whiskers. Emperor Franz Joseph of Austria-Hungary was a man of habits from his daily schedule to his famously conservative tastes, but nothing about him was more instantly recognizable than his sideburns. Thick, perfectly groomed, and extending down the sides of his face like regal banners, they became such a defining feature that they earned the nickname Imperial Whiskers. These weren't accidental. Franz Joseph maintained them with the same discipline he applied to his empire, ensuring they were always symmetrical and immaculately trimmed. Portraits, coins, and official photographs all immortalized the whiskers, turning them into a symbol of authority as much as his military uniform. Foreign visitors might not recall the details of his policies, but they remembered the whiskers. Over time, they became almost as much a part of Austria's imperial branding as the double-headed eagle. Yet while Franz Joseph's facial hair was impressive, the next king in our sequence preferred his animal companions far more exotic, hopping around the gardens of Kew. King George III kept a pet kangaroo at Kew Gardens. King George III, often remembered for his bouts of mental illness and his role in losing the American colonies, also had a softer and more eccentric side, one expressed in his fondness for animals. Among the exotic creatures housed at the Royal Menagerie in Kew Gardens was a kangaroo, a gift from Australia at a time when such animals were virtually unknown in Europe. The kangaroo became something of a local sensation, drawing visitors who marveled at its strange hopping gait and powerful tail. For George, the animal symbolized Britain's expanding reach across the globe, a living testament to the empire's curiosity and ambition. The king reportedly enjoyed visiting it, observing its movements with fascination. While the kangaroo's presence was a novelty, it also reflected the era's practice of showcasing exotic animals as symbols of imperial pride. Still, George's pet project was nothing compared to the sweeping dietary rule issued by another queen in our list, one that sought to reshape her subjects' eating habits entirely. Queen Elizabeth I banned the eating of meat on Wednesdays to encourage fish consumption. Queen Elizabeth I was not just a monarch but also, in her own way, a policymaker with a taste for subtle economic engineering. One of her more curious laws was a ban on eating meat on Wednesdays, intended to encourage the consumption of fish. This wasn't an arbitrary dietary whim, it was designed to support England's fishing industry and preserve livestock supplies. By mandating a midweek shift in eating habits, Elizabeth hoped to strengthen the economy and ensure a reliable food source for her people. While the law was framed as an act of piety, echoing older religious fasting traditions, its real motive was pragmatic. Of course, enforcing such a rule in an era without modern surveillance was tricky, and many undoubtedly ignored it. Still, the decree shows how even the dinner table could become an instrument of statecraft. And if Elizabeth's policy was about abundance and preservation, the next king in our list took a far more personal approach to creating abundance by building a fake mountain for his own amusement. King Christian IV of Denmark built a fake mountain so he could go skiing in flat Copenhagen. Denmark's landscape is famously flat, which posed a problem for King Christian IV, an avid admirer of skiing. Rather than accept this geographical limitation, Christian decided to solve it by having a fake mountain built. The artificial slope allowed him to indulge in winter sports without leaving Copenhagen, transforming a patch of otherwise ordinary terrain into a royal playground. It was an expensive and somewhat absurd undertaking, but Christian was not a ruler who shied away from grand gestures. The mountain became a curiosity for the court and a symbol of the king's determination to bend the natural world to his desires. In an age when engineering feats were still relatively rare, the creation of an artificial ski slope was as much a statement of wealth and power as it was a personal indulgence. Yet even Christian's man-made peak seems modest compared to the next queen's commitment to giving her pets a burial fit for royalty. Queen Victoria had her pets buried in tiny coffins with engraved nameplates. Queen Victoria's love for her animals went far beyond casual affection. It extended into elaborate, almost ceremonial mourning. When one of her many pets died, the Queen insisted on giving it a proper burial, complete with a tiny coffin and an engraved nameplate. Dogs, birds, and other cherished companions were laid to rest with the kind of dignity usually reserved for human courtiers. These miniature funerals often took place on the royal estates, and Victoria herself was sometimes present to ensure that everything was conducted with solemn respect. The engraved nameplates, often in ornate script, served as permanent reminders of each animal's place in her life. To visitors, it might have seemed eccentric or even excessive, but for Victoria, it was an expression of loyalty repaid in kind. Her pet cemetery at Osborne House became a strange yet touching monument to a queen who valued devotion, no matter the species. And while her gestures were deeply sentimental, the next emperor on our list channeled his passion into something far more active, galloping across fields with bow in hand. Emperor Meiji's favorite hobby was horseback archery. Emperor Meiji, the monarch who presided over Japan's dramatic transformation into a modern state, still found time to indulge in traditional pastimes. One of his favorites was horseback archery, or yabusame, an ancient martial art that demanded speed, precision, and balance. Dressed in ceremonial garb, Meiji would ride at full gallop down a narrow track, drawing his bow to strike targets positioned along the route. The sport wasn't just recreation, it was steeped in symbolism, linking the emperor to Japan's warrior traditions and reinforcing his image as a leader rooted in both modern progress and ancient honor. Spectators at these events were treated to a rare display of imperial skill, a reminder that the emperor's authority was as physical as it was political. Yet for all the discipline of Yabusame, the next king in our sequence preferred a much darker display of toughness, one that would have chilled even the most hardened observers. King Frederick William I of Prussia made his son watch executions to toughen him up. Known as the Soldier King, Frederick William I of Prussia valued military discipline above all else, even in parenting. Determined to raise his heir, the future Frederick the Great, into a hardened ruler, he subjected the boy to a regime of strict training and harsh lessons. Among the most disturbing of these was forcing his young son to witness public executions. The king believed that exposing him to the spectacle of death would steel his nerves and prepare him for the grim realities of leadership. For the young prince, the experience was traumatic rather than educational, and it deepened the already tense and volatile relationship between father and son. While Frederick William saw cruelty as a form of preparation, the next queen on our list approached her position with a much lighter, though no less unusual touch, installing a device in her palace that no other monarch could boast of. Queen Elizabeth II owned an ATM inside Buckingham Palace. In a palace filled with priceless art, ornate furnishings, and centuries of royal history, perhaps the most unexpected feature was something you might find in the corner of an ordinary high street bank, an ATM. Installed for the convenience of the royal household, the cash machine was provided by Coutts, the Queen's personal bank, and was available exclusively to members of the royal family. It was discreetly located, far from public view, and served as a private source of funds for day-to-day needs, though one suspects that day-to-day expenses in Buckingham Palace were a little different from those of the average Londoner. The existence of the ATM became a light-hearted symbol of the way the monarchy blended tradition with modern amenities, proof that even in a world of ceremonial crowns and state carriages, the practical conveniences still had their place. Yet while Elizabeth's ATM was a sign of quiet modernization, the next king on our list met his end in a much louder and far more violent fashion. King James II of Scotland died when his own cannon exploded during battle. In 1460, King James II of Scotland was leading his forces in the siege of Roxburgh Castle, a stronghold still under English control. As an enthusiastic supporter of artillery and warfare, James was personally inspecting one of his prized cannons when disaster struck. The weapon exploded, killing the king instantly in front of his soldiers. Accounts suggest that the blast was so violent it tore off part of his body. His death was a grim reminder of the dangers of early gunpowder technology weapons that could just as easily destroy their owners as their enemies. For Scotland, the loss was sudden and destabilizing. For historians, it's one of the more striking examples of how royal enthusiasm for military innovation could backfire, quite literally. And while James's death was a tragic accident, the Roman emperor who follows him in our list embraced excess in a way that was far from deadly, unless you count the effects on the stomach. Emperor Caligula. Allegedly through parties where guests were served gold flakes to eat. Caligula's reign over Rome is remembered for extravagance and indulgence bordering on the absurd, and few tales capture that better than the banquets where he reportedly served guests dishes laced with actual gold flakes. These were not symbolic decorations. The gold was meant to be consumed, passed through the body as a decadent display of wealth and waste. Guests, whether awed or horrified, had little choice but to comply, for refusing such an offering could be seen as an insult to the emperor himself. The practice was not only an ostentatious flaunting of resources but also a deliberate reminder of Caligula's absolute power. He could make the richest metal in the world into something as fleeting and disposable as a morsel of food. While his golden feasts were meant to impress and intimidate, the next king on our list displayed his love of the arts in a far gentler though still unconventional fashion. King Charles II of England loved theatre so much he once snuck on stage during a performance. King Charles II, restored to the English throne after years of Puritan rule, brought with him a passionate love of the theatre. He reopened playhouses, encouraged women to perform on stage for the first time, and surrounded himself with playwrights and actors. But his appreciation sometimes crossed into playful mischief. On one occasion, Charles reportedly could not resist stepping onto the stage during a live performance, blending into the scene as though he were part of the cast. The startled actors had to improvise around their monarch, no doubt careful to keep the moment flattering. For the audience, it must have been both thrilling and bewildering, one moment enjoying a carefully scripted drama, the next watching the king himself stroll into the story. This impulsive cameo was emblematic of Charles's charm. He blurred the line between spectator and performer, ruler and subject. And while his stage invasion was driven by enthusiasm, the queen who follows in our list approached competition with a level of commitment that shocked her peers, especially when alcohol was involved. Queen Anne of Denmark had a drinking contest with the King of France and won. Queen Anne of Denmark, wife of King James VI of Scotland, later James I of England, was not only known for her political influence, but also for her ability to hold her own in social gatherings. During a visit to France, she reportedly engaged in a drinking contest with the French king and emerged victorious. This was no polite tasting of wine. It was a full display of endurance, with courtiers watching in awe, and perhaps mild horror, as she matched, then surpassed, her royal counterpart, glass for glass. The feat became the stuff of gossip, reinforcing her reputation as a woman of formidable constitution. While her victory may not have altered the course of diplomacy, it certainly secured her place in the annals of regal party legends. And if her triumph was celebrated with laughter, the next king in our list was nearly undone by an altogether less festive event. An unexpected medical emergency on the eve of his coronation. King Edward VII's coronation was delayed because he got appendicitis. In 1902, preparations for King Edward VII's coronation were reaching their peak. London was dressed in bunting, Dignitaries from across the empire had arrived, and the ceremony was only days away. Then disaster struck. Edward developed a severe case of appendicitis. In an era when the condition was often fatal, the situation was urgent. Surgeons performed a then relatively new operation to remove his appendix, and the king recovered, but the coronation had to be postponed for over a month. The delay was unprecedented, causing logistical chaos and disappointment among those who had travelled great distances for the event. Yet Edward's survival turned the postponement into a kind of triumph. The public celebrated not just his eventual coronation, but also the fact that modern medicine had saved their king. Still, while Edward's emergency was purely medical, the next emperor in our line chose to spend his free time studying creatures so delicate they could vanish with a single touch. Emperor Akihito loved jellyfish and studied them in his spare time. Emperor Akihito of Japan, already known for his deep interest in marine biology, found himself particularly fascinated by one of the ocean's most ethereal creatures, the jellyfish. Delicate, translucent, and almost alien in appearance, jellyfish became the subject of his quiet, meticulous study. In between his imperial duties, Akihito would spend hours examining specimens, making careful observations, and collaborating with marine scientists. His fascination wasn't a passing hobby, it was an extension of his lifelong commitment to understanding marine ecosystems. The emperor's jellyfish research contributed to scientific literature, proving that his interest was more than ceremonial. It's an oddly serene image, the ruler of Japan leaning over a tank, watching these fragile creatures drift like living watercolors. Yet, while Akihito's marine curiosity was peaceful, the next king in our list expressed his authority in a far more domestic and competitive setting, banning a popular board game for being too intense. King George V banned his children from playing Monopoly because it was too competitive. King George V, grandfather to Queen Elizabeth II, presided over a royal household where discipline and tradition were paramount. When Monopoly began making its way into British homes, the king took one look at the game's ruthless property trading and endless haggling and decided it had no place in the palace. Declaring it too competitive, he banned his children from playing altogether. It wasn't just about preventing arguments. George V valued decorum and unity in his family, and a game designed to bankrupt one's opponents clashed with his ideals. The ban became one of those curious royal anecdotes that revealed a softer, if slightly overbearing, paternal streak. While his decision was rooted in family harmony, the queen who follows in our sequence took a far more aggressive stance in a domestic pet dispute, one that ended in a canine skirmish on palace grounds. Queen Elizabeth II once had her corgis attack a visiting dog belonging to Princess Anne. Queen Elizabeth II's devotion to her corgis was legendary, and the dog's behaviour often reflected their royal mistress's fierce loyalty. On one occasion, however, that loyalty boiled over into chaos. During a visit, Princess Anne brought her own dog to the palace, an act that might have seemed harmless until Elizabeth's corgis decided the newcomer was an intruder. The pack reportedly surrounded and attacked the visiting canine, forcing attendants to rush in and break up the scuffle. The incident, while perhaps mortifying to the humans involved, was a vivid reminder of the corgi's territorial streak. For Elizabeth, the episode likely reinforced her belief that her dogs were more than pets. They were guardians of her personal space and routine. Still, while canine politics could get tense, the next king in our lineup preferred his role-playing to be far less combative, though it still almost landed him in trouble with the law. King Henry VIII once disguised himself as a commoner to mingle at a fair and nearly got arrested. King Henry VIII loved pageantry, but he also relished the thrill of stepping outside his royal role. On one occasion, he decided to attend a public fair disguised as an ordinary man. Dressed in plain clothes and accompanied by a few equally incognito companions, he wandered among the stalls, chatted with townsfolk, and enjoyed the rare freedom of anonymity. The problem came when someone mistook his behavior for troublemaking and threatened to arrest him. The king, perhaps amused at first, quickly realized the situation could escalate. Only after revealing his true identity did the confrontation dissolve, leaving the would-be enforcers horrified and apologetic. Henry likely returned to court with the story, as a personal triumph proof that he could walk among his subjects unnoticed, but also a reminder that even a king wasn't immune to the rules of common life when stripped of his crown. And while Henry's escapade ended with laughter, the next emperor in our list sought public attention deliberately, and on a stage very few rulers would dare to step onto. Emperor Nero performed as an actor and singer in public, scandalizing Roman elites. For a Roman emperor, public performance was considered beneath the dignity of the throne, but Nero, ever eager to defy convention, embraced the stage with gusto. He sang, acted, and even played musical instruments before live audiences, taking on roles in plays and competing in artistic festivals. While commoners often enjoyed his performances or at least pretended to the Roman elite were scandalized. To them, the emperor's presence on stage blurred the line between ruler and entertainer, diminishing the gravitas of imperial power. Nero, however, reveled in the attention, basking in applause whether it was genuine or coerced. His vanity and need for validation were as legendary as his cruelty, making his artistic pursuits both a personal passion and a political provocation. Yet, for all his theatrical self-indulgence, Nero wasn't alone among monarchs. In using entertainment to bolster his ego, the next king in our completed journey did so in a way that would have delighted children, but baffled his contemporaries. And with that, we've reached the end of the 101 royal oddities, from 20-minute reigns to glass pianos, pet zebras, and imperial sideburns. What ties them together isn't just the absurdity of the facts, but the way each one reveals a crack in the polished facade of monarchy. Behind every crown is a human being with quirks, impulses, and flaws, magnified by power and preserved by history. Some of these stories make the royals seem endearingly human. Others expose the gulf between their world and ours. All of them, however, prove that truth is often stranger than fiction, and when it comes to royalty, the truth wears ermine robes while doing something utterly ridiculous.